All right, folks, let's take a look at chapter 13. Here's a little image to get us started. And then here is the 5 sections. We'll take them one at a time, starting with the first one, the fruits of manifest destiny. And here is that focus question. So here we go. Slavery moved to the center of national politics in the 1840s because of territorial expansion. By that decade, nearly all land east of the Mississippi was in white hands, and economic crisis pushed many settlers west. Between 1840 and 1845, several thousand traveled nearly 2,000 miles to Oregon in the far northwest, and by 1860, nearly 300,000 had traveled to Oregon as well as California. During the 1840s, the United States and Great Britain jointly administered Oregon. Nearby Utah was part of Mexico, but national boundaries mattered little to Americans who settled these regions. The idea that Americans had a divine mission, known by the end of the 1840s as manifest destiny, to settle the continent intensified in these years. America's acquisition of part of Mexico directly raised the issue of slavery. When Mexico achieved independence from Spain in 1821, it was almost as large as the United States in territory and population. But Mexico's northern provinces of California, New Mexico, and Texas were remote, sparsely populated, and bordered by Indian country. In New Mexico and California, a minority of Mexican landowners and church officials lived among larger Indian populations, sometimes compelling them to work. In 1821, the Santa Fe Trail was opened, connecting the city with Independence, Missouri, and significant American trade. In 1834, hoping to reduce the power of the Catholic Church and attract settlers to California, the Mexican government dissolved mission landholdings and emancipated Indians working for friars, though only for many of them to end up being forced to work for the new landowners. By the 1840s, California was also linked to the United States by American ships that traded in the region. Texas was the first region of northern Mexico to be settled by a significant number of Americans. The Mexican government, hoping to develop the area, accepted an offer by Moses Austin to colonize the area with Americans. In 1820, he received a large land grant, which his son, Stephen Austin, sold to American settlers. By 1830, when Americans outnumbered the Tejanos, the Mexican and Indian peoples of the area, Mexico annulled existing land contracts and prohibited future American immigration to Texas. Led by Stephen Austin, American settlers demanded autonomy within Mexico. Slavery exacerbated tensions. Mexico had abolished slavery, but in Texas, local authorities had allowed American settlers to bring enslaved people with them. Mexico's ruler, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, sent an army in 1835 to impose the central government's authority on the region, causing rebels there to form a provisional government and call for Texan independence. In March 1836, Santa Anna's army stormed the Alamo in San Antonio and killed all of its defenders. But soon, forces under Sam Houston routed Santa Anna's army and forced him to recognize Texas independence. In 1837, the Texas government called for the United States to annex the territory, but Presidents Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren rejected the offer, fearing addition of a slave state would spark sectional conflict. President John Tyler revived the annexation of Texas as a means of saving his failed administration and winning Southern support for his renomination in 1844. When a letter from John C. Calhoun, then Tyler's Secretary of State, linked annexation to the strengthening of slavery, Henry Clay and Martin Van Buren, prospective candidates for the Whig and Democratic parties, respectively, met and agreed to reject annexation, fearing it might spark a war with Mexico. They were trying to keep slavery out of national politics. Clay received the Whig nomination, but at the Democratic convention, Southerners bent on annexation dumped Van Buren for James K. Polk, a former Tennessee governor and ardent annexationist. Polk was a slaveholder whose plantations in Tennessee and Mississippi were so brutal only half of the enslaved children born in them lived to the age of 15, and adults continually fled. The Democrats' platform called for the reannexation of Texas, which wrongly implied that Texas had been part of the Louisiana Purchase and the reoccupation of Oregon. Polk narrowly defeated Clay in the election. If the Liberty Party candidate James G. Birney had not received 1,600,000 votes in New York, Clay would have been elected. In March 1845, only days before Polk's inauguration, Congress declared Texas part of the United States. Polk had 4 goals: reduce the tariff, reestablish the independent treasury, settle the Oregon dispute, and bring California into the United States. Congress enacted the first 2 goals, and the third was secured through an agreement with Britain dividing up Oregon. Having backed down from the 54-40 or fight promise of his campaign and agreed on a border farther south, many Northerners felt betrayed by the new president, especially when he refused to back down on land acquisition goals with Mexico. Polk offered to buy California from Mexico, but Mexico refused to negotiate, and by early 1846, Polk was planning for war. In April, U.S. soldiers sent into the disputed area between Texas and Mexico inevitably came to blows with Mexican troops. Polk claimed that Mexicans had shed blood upon American soil, and he called for a declaration of war. The Mexican War was the first American war fought largely on foreign soil, and most Americans, believing America was a selfless guardian of freedom, supported the war. But a large minority of Northerners opposed it, believing that the Polk administration hoped to secure new lands for slavery in slave states. Henry David Thoreau was jailed in Massachusetts for refusing to pay taxes, and he wrote an essay on civil disobedience, defending his actions, which later inspired Martin Luther King Jr. Abraham Lincoln, a Whig representative from Illinois, also opposed the war. In June 1846, American rebels in California declared independence from Mexico, and American troops soon occupied that region. American forces secured New Mexico at the same time. Most of the fighting occurred in central Mexico. In early 1847, after defeating Santa Anna's army at Buena Vista and following Mexico's refusal to negotiate, American forces marched to and captured the capital, Mexico City. In February 1848, the two governments agreed to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which confirmed the annexation of Texas and ceded California and present-day New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah to the United States. The United States paid Mexico $15 million for the land. This established the nation's present territorial boundaries except for the Gadsden Purchase bought from Mexico in 1852 and Alaska purchased from Russia in 1867. While the Mexican War is only a footnote in most Americans' historical memory, many Mexicans regard the war as a central event of their national history and a source of continued resentment of the United States. As Mexican negotiators argued in 1848, it was unprecedented to go to war with a country because it refused to sell territory to a neighbor. The territorial acquisition meant that the United States absorbed 500,000 square miles of Mexico and between 75,000 and 100,000 Spanish-speaking Mexicans, as well as 150,000 American Indians. The treaty guaranteed male citizens the rights of Americans, a provision designed to protect the property of large Mexican landowners in California. The only mention of Indians' presence was as savage tribes who were to be prevented from raiding into Mexico across the new border. Overall, the first half of the 19th century saw residents of the region who had gone from being Spaniards to Mexicans and then finally to Americans, shifts that imposed the necessity of adjusting to new identities as if they were immigrants. After 1836, Texas became a prime example of a Western borderland. Anglos and Tejanos had fought together during the Revolution, but relations soon soured as land-hungry Anglos expelled some Mexicans, including former allies, now suspected of loyalty to Mexico. A problem inherent to borderlands, many longtime residents were now considered aliens in their own homes and faced pressures to Americanize. While some Tejanos sent their children to English-language Protestant schools, most refused to convert from Catholicism, despite the church's declining power. Tejanos often used ambiguous identities to their advantage, with women seeking divorces under United States divorce law, which were more liberal than Mexico's, and some Tejano men avoiding the Confederate draft during the Civil War by claiming Mexican citizenship. After independence, but before annexation, the territory in South Texas between the Nueces and Rio Grande rivers was claimed both by Texas and Mexico, though it was actually controlled on the ground by the Comanche. Conflict was frequent and authority was contested until the United States annexed Texas, even after which the Comanche would continue to exert tremendous influence until the 1860s and 1870s. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo guaranteed male citizens their liberty, property, and all the rights of American citizens, while regarding Indians only as savage tribes. Manifest Destiny invigorated American notions of white racial supremacy. In the 1840s, territorial expansion began to be seen as showing the inherent superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race, a mythical identity defined by its opposites: blacks, Indians, Hispanics, and Catholics. 19th century concepts of race drew together ideas about color, culture, national origin, class, and religion. American writers linked American freedom and the allegedly natural freedom-loving characteristics of Anglo-Saxon Protestants. For many Americans, Texas's annexation and the conquest of Mexico were victories of civilization, progress, and liberty over the Catholic Church's tyranny and the natural incapacity of mongrel races. Some opposed expansion because they feared the nation could not assimilate the large non white Catholic population, whom they believed unfit for citizenship in a republic. American racial relations harmed many in the new American territories. While Mexico had abolished slavery, Texas gave it constitutional protections and denied civil rights to Indians and blacks. In Texas, only whites could buy land, and free blacks were barred from entering the state. Residents of Indian and Mexican origin in New Mexico were held to be too Mexican to be allowed democratic self government. Only Mexicans who emphasized their Spanish rather than Mexican heritage, especially those of important social status, were deemed white. With white migration lagging, the territory was not allowed to become a state until 1912. California had a non Indian population of fewer than 15,000 when the Mexican War ended, and for most of the 1840s, 5 times as many Americans emigrated to Oregon as to California, a trend only broken when Johann A. Sutter discovered gold in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains in January 1848. Fanned by newspaper accounts of instant wealth, a gold mania spread all over the world. Newcomers poured into the region in what came to be known as the Gold Rush, and the non-Indian population rose to 200,000 by 1852 and over 360,000 only 8 years later. The Gold Rush population was incredibly diverse. Experienced miners from Mexico and South America, tens of thousands of Americans who had never even seen a mine, and Irish, German, Italian, and Australian immigrants all poured into the region. Additionally, nearly 25,000 Chinese landed between 1849 and 1852, almost all of whom were young men who had signed long-term labor contracts with Chinese merchants, who in turn leased them to mining and railroad companies. San Francisco, a town of 1,000 in 1848, swelled to 30,000 by 1850, and became perhaps the most racially and ethnically diverse city in the world. Unlike farmers who moved west with their entire families, most gold rush migrants were young men. Women filled numerous roles in mining communities, including managing restaurants and boarding houses and working as laundresses, cooks, and prostitutes. Nonetheless, males outnumbered females almost 3 to 1 as late as 1860. The transition from surface mining to underground mining required large capital investments and exacerbated conflicts between diverse California gold hunting groups. Occasionally, vigilantes seized San Francisco, established courts, and executed accused criminals. White miners organized extra-legal groups that expelled foreign miners, such as Mexicans, Chileans, Chinese, French, and American Indians. While California long symbolized opportunity, the state restricted freedoms for many. The state constitution limited rights to vote and testify in court to whites. The Indian population was devastated by the miners, ranchers, and vigilantes of the Gold Rush era, and the state government paid bounties to private militias to attack the natives. Although California was a free state, thousands of Indian children deemed orphans or vagrants were bought and sold into slavery. Through the Mexican War, the United States gained possession of San Diego and San Francisco harbors, excellent ports to facilitate trade with the Far East. In the 1850s, the United States initiated the opening of Japan, which for 2 centuries had closed itself to almost all foreign contact. In 1853 and 1854, American warships commanded by Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Tokyo Harbor. Perry had been sent to negotiate a trade treaty, and he demanded that the Japanese deal with him. Alarmed by European intrusions into China and impressed by Perry's armaments, they opened 2 ports to American shipping. American diplomats persuaded Japan to open more ports to U.S. ships and establish full diplomatic relations between the two nations. Thus, the United States acquired refueling stops on the way to China, seen as the most important trading partner in Asia. Japan soon launched a modernization process that made it Asia's major military power. So, that's our first question, and we'll come to the next one in a minute.